While the gentlemen in the back get their name tags, welcome so much, everybody. I'm really pumped to have all of you here. When we started to plan this Bible course, we were told people are commitment shy. So we made it as modular as possible so everybody can choose when they want to come, how often they want to come, for sure. But we were like, if we have 5 people, that's probably a realistic goal, you know. And now we have more than 10 already. So thank you so much. It's amazing. Please welcome. We still have 3 chairs, and we'll pull up more if we need. Front row seats, so you're good. Maybe first some housekeeping. There's not very much to it. Maybe the short plan for tonight will be an hour or so of, let's say, session time. Call it lecture time if you want. Basically, I'm going to expose some information, and we will react to it to some capacity. But then really later on, after 8 o'clock, we will take more ample time to react to it and see how these things sit with everybody. And with that, I'm segueing into, we really want to make this a safe space in every aspect. So one of those for sure will be respecting each other's opinions on things, taking them seriously and speaking gently if we disagree, and it's very fair to disagree. We are by no means experts. We are simply a few young folks who have been to Bible college and who have encountered very important, in our opinion, information or messages there that are barely being talked about outside of Bible college, let's say, environments. And especially in churches, oftentimes these go unnoticed. And so we think it would be helpful to talk about these things. That's basically what we're doing. We want to facilitate the conversation around these things. We don't want to convince you of anything. So that aside, we also want to make this place a safe place in terms of COVID exposure. So we are asked to wear a mask at all times, and sorry for the inconvenience. It's not comfortable for sure. So even more so, thank you for coming out and for bearing with us in that way. And finally, if you need a bathroom, they're right out this door. On the one side of the corner is the ladies' bathroom, on the other side is the men's bathroom. We have some people who aren't at home here at Level Ground, so please feel at home. And without further ado, let's get into it. Are there any questions so far? We're good. All right, then. So, some introductory notes. Our goal is, in different words, we want to help understand or read the Bible well, which is a very lofty goal and a very big one. And one of the things that goes underneath that is if we want to read the Bible well, we must know what we are reading. What is it exactly we're reading? And oftentimes we don't really ask ourselves this question, and we kind of go off of assumptions that may or may not go unchallenged. And you may find these challenged during this Bible course. That is kind of the point of it. But the point is not to push anybody over, but it's just to make us aware and make us think. And some assumptions can be, for example, that the Bible is entirely a divine product. That is, in some way, shape, or form, dictated or so from heaven. That somebody is kind of in trance almost and writes down the words exactly as God dictates them. And that then almost makes the Bible exempt from any literary standards. And we kind of read the Bible on a plain level. Everything has exactly the same kind of message, or we expect the same things from anything we read in the Bible, and we encounter it in the exact same way. And that has some problems to it. On the other side of the spectrum, we might say, we can assume that the Bible is entirely a human product, and that it is just written by some ancient religious people. It's obviously fictional, might some say. It can be interesting, but that's kind of it. So we treat it as any other piece of literature. That then also brings problems with it, because then why is there so much fuss about it? Why are there religions that are based on this text? So what we propose is that, yes, the Bible is a human product. It is written by human authors with human language. It records human experiences, and it addresses human needs at the time of writing. But it is also a divine document because it follows God's interventions in human history. So it is human history, but it is God's interventions in this history. And the Bible is also about discerning God's intentions and human nature. And those don't always play very nicely together. Sometimes his intentions and our nature can be very much in conflict. And lastly, we believe that the message of the Bible transcends time. And even though it is recorded and is addressing human needs at the time of writing, these are still applicable to us. So, that is what we could call a balanced view. And it takes work to assume this view, to live that view, and to bring that view to the Bible. It is much easier to assume it is entirely divine, and we read it as such, or to assume it is entirely human. Common pitfalls when we don't bring this balanced view to bear. What can happen is that we neglect the human side of things. That usually happens first. we are much more comfortable, many Christians anyway, much more comfortable leaning towards the divine side of things. And then what is important is that we actually acknowledge the human element, the human aspect of the Bible, because God chose to work through humans. And the best argument I can make for that is that he became a human. That is a pretty good argument, that he is interested in working in and through humans. Another pitfall is that we do bite-sized reading, and there is some upsides to having Bible verses in our homes, wherever, maybe on the cars, but that cannot be our main dish, let's say. That can be a garnish, but it cannot be our main way of reading the Bible, because we miss out on a lot of the larger themes that are developing. And it's also a danger that we make these pieces of Scripture fit whatever we would like it to fit, whatever we would like it to support. And lastly, we can ignore or miss the genre of what we're reading entirely. So genre means what kind of literature is it? Is it a poem? Is it a narrative? Is it a phone book? Is it a recipe book? And with any other piece of literature that we read, we know that certain standards apply. If I, for example, I open a phone book, I'm not going to look for a recipe. We know that that's not appropriate, and that's not what you do. If I read a poem, I'm not going to look for instructions on how to fix a car. I mean, maybe somebody writes a poem about that, but that's her story. We recognize, okay, this is a poem, and I get into the mindset of understanding poetry. I expect poetry. And that same thing has to happen as well in the Bible, because we have tons of poetry in the Bible. We have tons of narrative story in the Bible. We have letters. And all of these things have their own standards that are, if we learn these standards and if we assume these standards as soon as we start reading, then that will help us gain much more out of this text. And basically the first segment out of this course, the first 3 lessons, today, next Monday, and in 2 weeks, basically the main point is highlighting the human aspect of Scripture. So that is basically it for introductory comments. Questions so far? Here you are, a quiet bunch. That makes things very easy. Alrighty. So I got some PowerPoint for you. Who likes PowerPoint? I do. And here we go. Oh, that's messy. Oh. I think we're there. This way? This way? Oh, there we go. So, before we go into ancient history, it is, I believe, important to understand where we're at with ancient history. And that today we have a very different view on ancient history than we did, let's say, 200 years ago. And I'm going to explain to you why I am saying that. For example, 200 years ago, archaeology was an entirely new field in science. It was almost non-existent. It was more so hobby archaeologists that would kind of stumble across things and be like, oh, that's interesting, and then maybe take it home to a museum and something. But very much a layman's science, let's say. And yeah, ancient cultures were largely still buried in the ground. Excavations did basically not happen. As I said, it was mostly if I stumble across something, then we find that something, but there was no planned excavation of something where, I expect to find something because of X or Y text or information. So, yeah, there's that. Hieroglyphs, so the Egyptian form of writing, the ancient Egyptian form of writing, very much still a conundrum. So, obviously, we had stumbled across some of it. This is some of it. But it was entirely undeciphered, not understood, so nobody could read it. Cuneiform is a different kind of writing from the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, Babylon. And basically what it is just a piece of clay. And when it's still wet, they take a wedge-shaped piece of wood and press into it. You see some circles as well. And that's their form of writing. So that was also already known at the time, 200 years ago, but it was also undeciphered. Nobody could read it. There was no extra biblical inscription of Hebrew. So basically the entire knowledge about ancient Hebrew was from Scripture. And that led to some interesting conclusions, to the point where people thought, okay, maybe ancient Hebrew is some kind of angelic language, because it seems to be entirely absent from anywhere else other than biblical texts. So there was this assumption that maybe God used this kind of heavenly or angelic language to communicate his desire or his will, which, you might think that probably already plays into a notion that, God dictates something using a very specific language that is not human. So there's that very interesting point there. The location of most biblical places was unknown. So we would read the Bible and okay, I don't know where Pergamum is, or I don't know where, any of these ancient places are. But we assume they exist. And the Old Testament was basically the only source of information regarding the very ancient past. So there's a ton of information around, let's say, the Greco-Roman time. But anything before that, let's say 2,000-3,000 years before Christ, was just dim, very black past. There was no information on it other than the Bible. And that then means, if this is my only piece of information, well, then that's the authoritative one. And then I assume that whatever story there is, I guess it's historical. I guess this is a historical account of actual events in that time. So there was this automatic assumption about those ancient stories. And yeah, that's basically the next point here. And that brings us to what archaeology is like today. And it is very different. For example, these ancient cultures, such as the Babylonian, the Hittites, the Ammonites, smaller tribes like that, or even Egypt, very large ancient culture. Obviously, a lot of Egypt is above ground, like the pyramids, for example, easy to spot. Other things had to be excavated, and that is happening today. We have large-scale excavations. Sorry, this beamer is not the greatest, but you can see that there is a large-scale excavation going on People plan these things, and they are very meticulous about how they do these excavations to learn from them as much as possible. This one is even a sheltered excavation, so a large roof has been built over the site so that the rain or any weathering wouldn't affect the results. Hieroglyphs have been deciphered, so we can now read ancient Egyptian. The same can be said about cuneiform. It has been deciphered, we can read it. And not just that, we don't just have a few fragments of these, but we have about 1 million of these clay tablets that we can read today. That's a ton. That's a lot of information about the ancient world, which we did not have 200 years ago. We do have extra-biblical Hebrew. That has been one major find of that is, for example, the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as they are also known. There's Hebrew in there that is extra-biblical, that are like recipes or something like that, administrative things. And we have found and identified a lot of the ancient places that are mentioned in the Bible. And that's not it. It doesn't stop there, but archaeology is very much like any other field of science. It's a constant stream of information at this point. Just like biology or whatever else it be, maybe psychology, there's a lot of new information that comes because a lot of people are invested in it and a lot of people study it. So a ton of information comes out every day. And because it is a science, the scientific method is applied to it. So in archaeology, because it is a science, we deduct in a logical manner. And being science, God isn't necessarily a part of it, not per definition. We try to identify what has happened here. If 1 + 1 is 2, then this and this in succession must mean this, regardless of if the Bible mentions this or not. And that brings challenges sometimes to, for example, the Old Testament or the New Testament. Today we're going to talk mostly about the Old Testament. And then the question is, now that we have all of this information and a constant stream of new information, what do we do with that? Especially if sometimes it appears to challenge what we think or what we understand about the Old Testament. And there are multiple ways in which we might react. One reaction can be to fight it. And we can be very much inclined to question, if a new scientific discovery is being made, then we challenge the conclusions that come from that. And, that it can be very tempting, because we don't like being challenged. And we can assume that, if something challenges the Bible, then it must be the enemy is behind this and he wants to discredit the Bible and it's all very evil. That can be one reaction that we can feel. Another one is we can maybe just let everything fall and flee from our post and just say, well, I guess it turns out it's all a scam anyway. Christianity is just a hoax, or, all of this is just made up story. So, who cares? I guess it was all for naught anyway. That can be another impulse that we can feel. And sometimes we can feel both of these at the same time. For example, if somebody were to tell you at the time of the Exodus, when the Israelites are assumed to go into the land of Israel, so around the year 1200 to 1400 BC, there seems to be no indication that Jericho was a heavily fortified city at that time. We do have great walls unearthed, but they appear to date from a time much prior, much earlier than that. And it seems like around that time it was more so a smallish military/trading outpost with not a whole lot of fortification. So if you hear this, do you feel something stir in you? Some kind of reaction? Do you feel a need to challenge this? To fight that information or to fight whoever says it? Question their motives? Do you maybe feel like, if that's not accurate the way I understand it, what else isn't? Does that mean that the whole Bible is just a scam or it's just made up. So does anybody feel something like that? I know I do if I hear something like that, it impacts me, because we're talking about a piece of scripture that I see as formative for myself. And if somebody says something about it that doesn't quite fit my own understanding of it, then it impacts me. So, but instead of fight or flight, what else can we do? Now, what's the third one usually in this sequence? Fight, flight, freeze. And I think freeze is not a good option. Freeze is, it's just being stagnant. It's not doing anything about it and just being very afraid. Instead, instead of making it FFF, I chose to make it I. So, flight, fight, or insight. Perhaps there's something to learn for us. Rather than assuming that, this is an evil scheme from the enemy, can we trust that God has got this? And there's no surprises to him. There's no information that is true and does not come from him. If he is the author of all truth, then all truth will lead to him. So perhaps there is a way for us to take challenging information and then bring that to God and ask him, can you help me see through this? Can you help me make this an insight? Because I don't want to fight needlessly. I don't want to flee. I would like insight from you. So that's the way I propose that we approach things. And that can lead to, eventually we look into this and perhaps there is a reason to fight things. Or perhaps there is a reason to accommodate new information, and then some paradigms, some ideas that we may have about a certain passage in the Bible, they might get reshaped. And then that is considered growth. It's not the same. It's not giving up anything. It's actually gaining things. Are you with me? All right. So with that, the next segment will be about history, and in particular the history of ancient Babylon, as per your outline. And it will be a little bit fast-paced. So this is going to be a bit like drinking from a fire hose. I'm just going to have that disclaimer right out here. And if you are a history nerd, if you really like history, this will be awesome for you. If you're not quite like that, don't worry at all. Obviously, there's no test, no exam at any point. And don't feel any pressure to retain any data whatsoever. The reason why I want to expose this history piece is because I would like to give you an impression of what ancient Babylon could have been like, as best as we can piece it together. And I believe that an impression anyway lasts a lot longer than any data that we try to retain. So if the data is too much for you, then focus on this impression. Build an impression around what ancient Babylon could have been like. All right, Mesopotamia. Some historical highlights here. The red area is what is called the Fertile Crescent. If you ever hear the Fertile Crescent, this is what people are on about. In ancient times, this red area is where most development has happened. And we are mostly going to talk about today about Mesopotamia, which is on the right-hand side, the right-hand wing there, with the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. And we can split that history into many different segments or periods. And one thing that maybe I should notice right off the bat is that this area, because of the rivers, is a very chaotic, in a sense, area. Those rivers flood, but they do not flood in a very predictable way, unlike the Nile. So we will talk about Egypt next time. Also a river that floods, but in a very different way. These two rivers, not so predictable, which creates a lot of either very good years of lots of harvest and lots of flourishing, but also a ton of destruction and flooding and destruction of cities, which then makes where if a city isn't destroyed by it, but it is weakened, either militarily or economically, it can be conquered much easier. So a very important piece in Mesopotamia is always a struggle for order, to impose order on the chaos, because the chaos always seems to be coming back, and it's always a struggle to gain back order. So the Uruk period, very much from the ancient past, 3,600 years to 2,900 years, this is where city-states begin to rise in this region. So again, this is the region where we find some of the oldest civilizations that we can figure out at the moment anyway. So hence, Fertile Crescent, where humanity really came to flourish. So this is basically what it means, the city-states, is that an urban focus begins to form. Beforehand, cities weren't really a thing. It was more so, it was nomadic people going to and fro, different pastures and so on and so forth. Now we start to see cities being built, being fortified, and people living in urbanized centers. And with that, there's also, not everybody is a farmer anymore, but now there's different classes of people. Maybe there's a stonesmith who makes tools for somebody else, and things like that. So we start to have specialized vocations for people. This is also where writing, as far as we know, where writing really begins. And that is the cuneiform that I showed you earlier. That kind of writing is the earliest that we know of. And that dates back to this time. And interestingly, during this time, these city-states would be ruled by priests. So the priest was the king of that city. And that's an interesting piece, because in the Bible we read about Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a person whom Abraham meets. And he is a priest king. So there's an interesting overlap there. Perhaps Melchizedek fits into this category, or perhaps we can understand him as one of these city rulers, priests, in the text of Genesis. The next period of time, you have early dynasties. So a dynasty is when one ruler's offspring is the next ruler. So no longer do we have priests being rulers, but now we have monarchs, and their son, usually the firstborn son, becomes the next ruler. And just based on heritage, not based on any other merit. And now we see a separation between the priestly role and the king, the government role. And usually that priest now ends up serving the king. And, we can see that could be very beneficial for the king, but perhaps not so good for the people, because now religion can be used to manipulate people, for example. And kingship is understood as divinely inherited. So these kings would place a lot of emphasis on heritage. They would trace their heritage back until at some point their ancestor came from heaven. So that's how they would claim, that would be their claim to kingship, is that they are of divine descent. And yes, with that, these people gain more power than before. Then we have the Acadian Empire. The Acadians were one group of people who then spread across multiple city-states and now took over a larger chunk of what we now know as Babylon. And basically that is the first empire as such, because now we have an army taking over large amounts of land. So Sargon the Great pronounces himself the king of the world, because basically the world that he knows, as far as he knows the world, he rules it. So he is not aware of, let's say, ancient Egypt, which is farther away. But at this point, apparently, there seems to be not much communication going on yet. And very interestingly, Enheduanna is the earliest woman ever mentioned anywhere. So that's an interesting piece. Meaning the earliest woman mentioned anywhere being the text of Genesis, for example. We can assume, if we assume it is a literal historical account of the ancient past, then we could say, okay, Eve was the first woman. But the earliest manuscripts of Genesis only date to around the time of Jesus. So these cuneiform texts date about 2,500 years prior to Jesus, before Jesus. And on these, we have the first mention, extra biblical mention of a woman. And I find that's pretty neat. And she was a priestess, just for that information. Then the next period is the so-called period, or the Dynasties, even larger power and wealth. And now we have very large building projects, such as, you may have seen similar buildings like this, is a so-called ziggurat. Not a cigarette, but a ziggurat. And we have the first immersion of written law codes. So now the kings would not just decide on the fly whatever is the rule, but now they would write down and standardize rules for their empire. Taxation is implemented. So imagine there was a time when taxation wasn't a thing at all. And now people came up with the idea, maybe taxation is a good thing, to fund the empire, fund development projects. Hence, we can afford, the Empire State Building like there. And that's that. Now there we go. Then we go to the next period, the so-called Old Babylonian period. So now for the first time, we see the word Babylon, because now the city of Babylon, until this point, was just a city. And there were different people groups that would sometimes take it over and sometimes not. So like the Acadians, for example. Now Babylon becomes the center of power. So you see power shifts all around in this region. Now it happens to be in the city of Babylon. And this is to this point, the largest empire in that area. The Hammurabi Dynasty is part of this period. And we have the Code of Hammurabi up here on the right. Sadly, you can't see any text on it because the beamer isn't that good. But it is very mesmerizing reading it, because there is a ton of interesting overlap or very similar sounding laws to what we find in Leviticus, for example. And Hammurabi, the lawgiver or the ruler at this time, actually, his intention, he starts his laws with his intention. And the intention is to bring liberation and justice to the people. And that, if you read the rest of those laws, that actually seems like he's really on it. Because there's, basically like Leviticus, there's a lot of reglementation. What happens if my ox gores yours? And what happens if my cow strays onto your land and is struck by lightning and is dead? Do you owe me, do you not? Or all these different scenarios. Very similar text we find in here. So it is a ton about regulation, what is fair and what is good. And this is also the time where the epic myths, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the stories of Atrahasis, are written down. So they're probably the story is probably much older than that, but at this time it gets into its finalized form, such as at least the earliest pieces that we have found. You can see them down there, not really, but a little bit, are from these times. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, since you said wasn't that Abraham's
Yes,
town? Yeah.
very much, yes. Yeah, his hometown.
Yeah.
You're correct.
So what?
Yes.
Myths, Gilgamesh, Empresses, what's that about? Or
We will get into that.
Okay.
Those are epic myths. So a myth is a story that explains the origin of something.
Yeah.
So we will read some of those in a little while. Any other questions?
Would you like me to try and turn one of the sets of lights off to see if we can see that better?
We could try that, yes. Perhaps these front ones, or maybe, I'm not sure which light switch it is.
Left-hand side. There you go.
Is that better?
It's a little better.
All right.
Can you see your notes?
Yes, yeah, all good.
Is that good?
Yep, I'm good.
yeah.
For the poor people that are going to be watching the recording, I'm sorry it's a bit darker, but you will still recognize me. No. That's fine. It's more important that the people who are actually here can follow the best. So the other one is more of a backup. Cool. Next period is the so-called Mitanni Hatti period. This is a people that is more on the northwestern corner of this larger area. So these people then, now the power center moves towards there. These people take over what was the old Babylonian kingdom. And now from this period, we have diplomatic communications, so letters between different rulers, and all the different contracts that they would work out with one another. Also, very interesting, they sound quite similar to what we read in the Bible. Different, what's the word I'm looking for? Covenants. There you go. So very similar to the covenants, covenant structure that we read in the Bible about. So yeah, different treaties, and they're related. There's always there are blessings and curses. If you follow through with your commitment, you shall be blessed. You shall be cursed if you don't. Which sounds familiar. And around this time would fall the Israelite conquest of Canaan. Okay, so that's we're now stepping sideways a little bit and track. Where is Israel at this time? It's basically at that stage. So Israel is basically beginning when Babylon has already been there for about 2,500 years. Yes?
Yeah, since we're going way back,
Yes.
when did Moses write the Ten Commandments?
Excellent question. So if the Ten Commandments, so that would be Leviticus, that would be during the Exodus. So it would also roughly fall into this time frame.
The Mitanni Hatti?
Yes. So around 1400 BC.
Well, 1400.
So yeah, thereabout. Any other questions?
So was that what, like, when they talk about the old covenant, like, was there like any like era like where like he actually like a prophet that he used like to reveal his first covenant?
You're talking about God?
Yeah, to reveal God. How did he reveal his first covenant? And did he reveal it through Moses, or?
There you go. That's an excellent question there. So the story of Israel as such is a very interesting one when looked at through an archaeological lens, because some of it, actually we will talk more about that next Monday, because then we will talk about Egypt. And Egypt is more so the origin kind of story of Israel. As you know, there's the patriarchal period of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, and that then leads into captivity in Egypt, and then out of there is basically, now we're talking the nation of Israel at that point. But if we, spoiler for next time, if we actually look into the archaeological record, some of these pieces are corroborated, but some of them are actually challenged. So the whole timeline might actually, if we piece together the biblical account and extra-biblical, let's say, archaeological account, the timeline might actually look somewhat different, especially in terms of which document was written at which time. But I don't want to spoil too much of that. If you are okay with that, we can leave that for next Monday. All right then, on we go. Now we're getting quite modern in ancient terms. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is another people that are close to the area of the Mitanni Hatti, and they take over that entire region. You see a darker shaped color. That is more so what Assyria used to be, and then about 30 years later, it is the whole green thing. So much larger. It is the largest empire to that time. So it's we're building. Every empire gets kind of larger than the one before. And this is the first time where we have large overlap with Israel, where now much of Israel is actually taken over by this empire. So the northern part, the northern kingdom of Israel is taken over. What you see left here is the kingdom of Judah is left. That's all. All that's left of Israel. And they kind of hang on by the skin of their teeth. Like, barely make it. Jerusalem is under siege, but they survive that. You can read, I believe it is it Ezra? Or is it Elijah? Not Elijah. Come on. Isaiah. There we go. It's in Isaiah. You can read about the miraculous saving of the city of Jerusalem, and the enemies are routed. So, at this time we have Nineveh as the center of power, capital of power. Again, a city that we are well accustomed to when we read the Bible. It pops up at different places. We're almost done with this section. So the Neo-Babylonians, now we had the old Babylonian kingdom, now we have the new Babylonian kingdom. Because right after the Assyrian Empire, it's again Babylon, that city, and that people in that city who then take power from Assyria, and basically take over that entire empire, and then build from there, so it becomes an even larger empire. And but now the remaining Israelites are taken into exile. So now Jerusalem and Judah are taken into exile. So what we have to know there is it's not actually every single Israelite that goes into exile, but it is more so the elite. It is the educated, it's the people especially who live in Jerusalem, are the ones, the ruling people of Israel. Those are the ones, such as Daniel, for example, they are taken into exile. And the rulers as well, they are especially mentioned. But it's not every single Israelite, so some would remain in the land. And yes, this city, Babylon, it's a very important one in the Bible. It is mentioned by name 262 times. So something is up with this city. It means a whole lot to biblical authors. But we'll talk more about that. I think Christian is talking about symbolism, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but it might be one that can come up in future classes in this course. And this is the last one. The Persian period kind of wraps up the high time of Mesopotamia. The Persians are a people who come from the northeast of that area. It's a mountainous area, which is nowadays Iran. And basically these people take over Babylon, which is already a huge empire, and expand even larger from there, going into Egypt, going into all the way up to Turkey. So it's a super huge, at that time again, the largest empire ever seen. Everybody thinks, well, this is the whole world is now Persia, the Persian Empire. And but interestingly, we have a shift here from very oppressive rule to a rule. So King Cyrus is basically the first one who tries to modernize, in the sense that he realizes, well, maybe we have fewer issues with different peoples and people groups and religions if we let them be. As long as they pay taxes, as long as they are loyal, they can have their own religion. And we might even support that. If we show some support, then they will be friendly to us. And that is exactly what happened to the Israelites. They were free to go back to their home country, to Judah for the most part, and build their temple. And they would even get gifts to complete that task and to basically rebuild their heritage. So very different kind of ruling at this point to what has been seen before, especially if we go 2 steps back. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was extremely brutal. Some of the most gruesome that we know of in history. Just to paint you a picture, one particular city, a Judean city that was under siege and eventually taken by the Assyrians. The name escapes me now of that city. But the Assyrians would take prisoners, so Jewish prisoners, and they would make these prisoners build the rampart, the siege rampart to enter the city, so that they would be the only ones exposed to the arrows that would be fired from the Jewish people in that city. So now you have a conflict of interest. It's either you let these people build a rampart, or you zap one of your relatives, perhaps. Maybe you know people or people of your own kind who are forced to work against you. And that's one of the more milder stories, actually. I don't want to be too gruesome here, but that kind of thing, that kind of rule was now considered outdated. Let's actually convince people that it makes sense to work together in that sense. All right. That wraps up our very quick history lesson on ancient Babylon. One takeaway perhaps that I want to throw in here is when Israel pops up, Babylon already exists for thousands of years. So these large ziggurat buildings had been around for thousands of years when Israel actually was deported to Babylon. So perhaps to gain an impression, as a mental exercise, what would it be like to be part of a small Jewish nation, to be taken away into a foreign country where they have structures like this, they have huge buildings that are already thousands of years old, and they have stories, they have written culture thousands of years old. How do you think would that impact you? It's not a rhetorical question, I'm actually asking.
Can you repeat that?
So if you imagine being an Israelite, in those days, then you would be taken captive and deported to Babylon. So a very large empire, a very powerful nation. And you go there, and for the first time you see yourself with your own eyes that these people are, it's not only a very vast empire, but extremely well established. So super large scale structures, something like you've never seen. What impression could that have on you?
Feel inferior.
Right?
I think there'd also be an understanding from the Babylonians' perspective of the beginning of the earth. And all these stories that are already made,
right.
They're learning them all in this new culture.
Right.
So it influences the way they think, what they believe about themselves, their human story.
Yeah. And I think we have evidence of that in Daniel, because he's actually instructed, right? He's not just being taken captive as a prisoner, but he's actually instructed to serve at the king's court, which means he had to be familiar with all of their writings, right? He would know them by heart. Also, he would know by heart his own culture, his own writings, the Hebrew heritage. So now if you have the two, what do you would he have maybe the same struggles that we could have today, where it's is fight, flight, or insight? Which one is it? Okay, not super talkative at this point. That's fine. not pushing anybody. Yes.
I would think that people would import and be much more competitive about their technologies.
Right.
Because it's you're oppressed like that. You're forced to adapt and stuff like that. Especially when you have so many wars back then, it's and it's so often. You just think about our lives and our walks and our paths and stuff like that. God, I can't do it myself. I need your wisdom, and that's. And how many times God's no, you don't rely on your own understanding, you rely on His understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
Very well put. All right, so we're running a bit late, but we'll roll with it. Now, let's dive into some parallel texts. I think this is now we're getting into the consequence of this development of Israel going into exile into this powerful nation. And I think as Crystal mentioned, I believe much of that has happened, of the Israelites wrestling with this new reality and all the stories that they hear and all this entirely different world, basically, that they are immersed into. Now, what do we do with that? And I think next up, we can appreciate some of what they did. So I will read to you, and you can read along or just listen. I have a copy about the story of Atrahasis. Now, this is mostly a paraphrase because the actual story is very long if you would read it word by word. So I have summarized it and paraphrased it. And then key sections I will quote directly. So yeah, let's read some ancient Babylonian text. So the story of Atrahasis begins in a world populated only by divine elders that are in Akkadian called Anunnaki. So you remember there was the Acadian Period. So it stems from that language. And divine warriors, which are called Igigi. So I didn't choose these names. It's not my fault. But yeah, that's what they're called. So we only have divine elders and warriors. And the warriors, or also called younger gods, are tasked with running the world. For example, tilling and watering the soil, producing food for the divine elders, and so on. When the divine warriors revolt and refuse to do all that work necessary, the creator god Ea Enki negotiates a settlement with them. And workers, or also called the Lulu, will be created to take on the care of the world and to dredge canals for the irrigation. The elders ratify that settlement and assign Nintu Mami, the patron goddess of the midwives, to carry out that project. To create a living being requires divine lifeblood, so the wise god We'ila is sacrificed by the divine assembly, and Nintu Mami takes his blood and mixes it with clay. And out of this mixture, living humans are formed. In other versions of this myth, that clay is thinned with saliva of the divine assembly instead of the blood of a god that was being slain. So, you can pause there a little bit. It's a lot going on here, lots of different gods. There's some anger from the lower gods because they don't want to do all the work. And now humans are created to take over that work. You with me? Can you follow that so far? Okay, let's continue reading. Eventually, the workers, or humans, also revolt on their own against the divine assembly and refuse to do the work. I guess nobody wants to work in the ancient times, just as today. And the divine assembly tries to force them back to work with epidemics and famines. So picture very similar themes as to the 10 plagues. So the divine assembly sends plagues to trouble these workers so that they should go back to work. Atrahasis is a human who stands in relatively good favor with the gods and is given instructions how to end the plagues. However, the human revolt persists, and finally the decision is made to destroy all humans with a flood. No human, including Atrahasis, is supposed to know about this plan. But even so, the compassionate Ea Enki warns Atrahasis. So Atrahasis is this character who is in good standing with the gods, but he fails to convince the other humans to behave, to do their work. Hence, now it's, a clean slate. We start all over. We destroy all humans. And here's a direct quote from that story. Ea Enki warns Atrahasis, "If I were you, I would pull down my house. I would build a barge. I would abandon all my possessions to save my life. Place a roof over the barge, cover it like the heavens cover the earth. Do not let the sun see inside, and close it completely. Make the joints strong, caulk the timber with pitch. I will gather flocks of birds for you and schools of fish." So there is a gathering of animals. At this point, we could think probably to feed Atrahasis. So Atrahasis warns the elders, human elders in this case, among the humans, and begins building his barge. Then he fills the barge with all sorts of animals. So now that's probably more, not just for their own support, not just for eating, but also to maintain animals. Before him and his family go on board, he hosts a banquet. That's interesting. Then the rain falls and the flood rises. The ensuing death and chaos create such a great noise that it terrified the divine assembly. in the aftermath, the divine assembly questions the wisdom of killing all the humans. Yeah, perhaps not that good of an idea. Now that there's no one to take on the work that is necessary, and no one to produce the food for all the gods. Luckily, Atrahasis and his family have survived, and the gods feed off of their Thanksgiving sacrifice at the end of the story. So, feel this for a little bit. Perhaps this was news. Perhaps this is interesting to you. I hope not distressing, that you may find familiar ideas in this text. Before we go into reactions of that, let's read the parallel text of Genesis, which would be Genesis 1, 26 to 28. You have that on a different copy, where it says parallels in the Bible, and then under Atrahasis is where we're going to read. So, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And then Genesis 2:7, so the next chapter, here's yet another narration of how God creates humans. "Then the Lord formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." Let's stop here. Let's think about this biblical view of humanity, how humans come about, versus how do humans come about in the Babylonian mindset and their history and their epic explanation of humanity. Do you find any similarities? You don't need to raise a hand, but I would like to hear somebody at this point.
Well, one part is like the subduing the earth, right? God creates humans, like kind of to take care of the world.
Right.
Which is a little bit of a different connotation here. It's more like, oh, I don't want to do the work, so here you go, and then you can do it. But
right.
Like in both cases, it's humans being created, being left in a sense on the world to...
For a purpose.
Yeah, exactly. To keep the order on Earth in a sense, right? And where the God or God is a little bit, or seems not as engaged in a sense, but still there.
Mm-hmm. So we may add there that there's delegation going on, right? In both instances, we have divine being or beings delegating humans to a purpose.
What's interesting to me is that in both cases, humans are formed out of clay.
Somehow ground material, either dust or clay, but we have, and both have the idea of we're made from very basic material. Basically the material that still keeps us alive, right? If there was no ground, there was no crops. If there's no crops, there's no food, right? So there's a very close connection to the ground.
And both have something of the divine, either like the blood or saliva or the breath.
Right. And all of those, I think, are very intimate pieces, right? So blood is something that, we only spill when necessary. We don't like... Blood is... To see blood usually is a negative sign. It's like, if I cut myself, I see blood, not a good sign. Something bad has happened. So obviously there's exceptions to that rule, but generally blood is a violent piece. But it's also very much like, it's a very intimate piece, because if I give of my blood, that, weakens me. It's a very close thing. If I give my blood for you, then, I'm giving some of my strength to you. And similarly, the breath of life, you have to be really close to feel somebody's breath, or to, get their breath into you. It's a very close connection. And same, I guess, with saliva as well.
I know there was a lot of, when we listened to the story of Atrahasis, it's sort of like there's two distinctive people. There's the elders and the younger gods.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's a caste system on
Right. Yeah, very well observed. And even that is, it's kind of only hinted at, but even among the humans, that layered society is also replicated, because Atrahasis is talking to the elders of the humans. They're just kind of mentioned in passing, but they're still, there's already tiering going on in the human society. So let's say if I throw this out, do you remember what I mentioned about the rivers in that region and what kind of environment those rivers created from time to time? Does any of that come to bear on the Babylonian text?
Like flooding, that something gets destroyed,
Right.
and then
Right.
you try to explain it in some way why that happened.
Mm-hmm. Very well put there, yeah. Or perhaps, like very much in that theme, there is a lot of chaos in the Babylonian story, right? There's a lot of, I don't want to do the work, you do the work. I don't want to do the, you do the work. And there's death happening. There's, first there's this God is, a certain God, deity is being slain, death to create something else. And then later there's a whole lot of death because all of humanity are supposed to be eradicated. So, but throughout there's a sense of violence. So a sense of chaos. And there's constantly, somebody has an idea of how, what should we do about this chaos? In the beginning, there's a chaos because nobody wants to do the work. Well, here's a solution. Let's create human beings. And then there's revolt. There's again chaos. Well, what do we do about it? Well, let's get rid of the humans. So, but there's always, the chaos seems to creep back in, and then there's a dramatic solution to that, which I find is very absent from the biblical account. We have a very peaceful creation and a very unobstructed creation. So God speaks and things come about. There's no need to slay anybody or anything. And the same for humans. So the humans are formed without the need for anything to die, without the need of bloodshed. And very much like what Monica said, that the purpose for the humans, while they have a purpose, they're tasked to doing something, they're tasked to rule. They're not tasked to be slaves, which is very much like the Babylonians would. That's what humans were supposed to be. They were supposed to be slaves to the gods, whereas in Genesis, humans have a government status. They have delegated power to rule over the earth and to stand in for God in creation, which is a very high elevated status for humans and a very low status in the Atrahasis, right? Let's continue on a little bit. Genesis 6, 9 to 21. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people of the earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build the ark. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door on the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. I am going to bring floodwater on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has breath of life in it, everything on the earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives. You are your sons' wives, yeah. You are going to bring the ark you are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, every kind of creature that moves along the ground. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. And then the end of the story goes like this. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. So this is after the flood has happened. Noah goes out of the ark and then worships God. Noah built an altar to the Lord, taking some of the clean animals and clean birds. He sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every indication of the human's heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." So now let's digest this piece a little bit. What is perhaps similar to the story of Atrahasis, to the flood section in there?
Both have a compassionate God, like warning the human.
Right.
The flood.
And there's a certain human that is in better standing than with the gods or the deity than the others, right? Very good observed there.
There's a boat being built.
Mm-hmm. There's an obvious parallel there, for sure. What about the sacrifice?
Clean one.
Right, clean animals. But it appears in both scenarios that the sacrifice does something. It affects the divine being. In the Atrahasis, it is the gods are like, phew, at least somebody survived. we have something to eat, and I think it's in the story where they're described as circling around the sacrifice like flies. So it's kind of like, whoa, okay, why did you even think about, wiping out the humans if you're that dependent on them, right? So it's a very strange scenario where it seems very apparent the gods way overreacted, right? But that's kind of the theme in Babylonian history. It's like it seems everybody is overreacting. What's different in the biblical narrative, in the Genesis narrative? Or perhaps what's similar?
In the biblical one, it seems like God heard or saw the sacrifice, but it touched his heart.
Right.
And it wasn't, and he just said, this isn't going to happen again.
Right. So there's an element of compassion, and there is an element of regret too, I think. I believe there is a parallel there, but God is way less affected by it in terms of survival. He does not depend on humans for his survival, but is entirely emotionally driven here. It touches God's heart more so than his stomach, right? He's not concerned about survival, but he is now thinking that, I don't want to do this again because it causes me pain. Killing off all these humans, even though they are wicked, causes me pain. And I don't want to do this anymore. So it's a very different kind of regret. All right, so we are a little bit past time. We have two options. We can either wrap it up here and then have a bit of a break. We have some Timbits, some water in the back. I think we should do that anyway. But then what we can do after that is dive into yet another ancient text that is very similar to a biblical story, or we can just take this one and dwell on this one and reflect on why is that the case? Why do these sound so familiar and so different? And how can that help us understand what the Bible is on about, the author of Genesis? What's the preference? Would you like to hear more? I mean, if we don't do it today, you can take the copies home and read it for yourself. So you have it either way. But we can. Would you rather cover more newish ground, or would you rather, if you choose to stick around, would you rather dwell on this and dissect this? Perhaps we would sit in a circle for that. That would make it a bit more relatable.
Should we vote?
Who's in favor of covering a new story? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Yeah,
9,
we
10.
got the one last page that's the story of last part of, or did we?
Yeah, the story of Utnapishtim.
That's, yeah, because we pretty well that covered everything else.
Yep. So that would be the one we would cover. Who would be in favor of digesting this one in more of a group setting? Sit in a circle. I mean, we can sit in a circle anyway. At this point, we don't have any PowerPoint. So who is in favor of that? One hand. It seems the majority is up for more new stuff. So let's do that. Please help yourself to some Timbits. I will put out some water as well. Refresh yourself. Hit the bathroom. And then we can make a circle with the chairs.